President Trump now thinks that he could have negotiated away the Civil War. This is the same president who failed with his first big bill in Congress, repealing and replacing Obamacare. No president in recent memory has done that, failed to pass his first major agenda item. And none of those recent presidents who were able to pass their first big agenda item ever said that we could have been spared the Civil War with better negotiating. Today, at the White House press briefing, Sean Spicer was asked to clear up the confusion about the president's position on whether everyone with pre-existing conditions will be guaranteed health insurance under a new Trump health care plan written by the most conservative members of the House of Representatives. It is a plan that makes it optional, in fact, for states to cover pre-existing conditions. Yesterday, in a television interview, President Trump left it unclear as to whether he would change that part of the bill and make it mandatory instead of optional. So Sean Spicer was asked about that today.
Was he referring to something he wants to push to include in the bill? Was he talking about the language that's already in there?
Well, I think both, in the sense that the MacArthur-Meadows amendment ensures that pre-existing existing conditions are continued to be covered. But then obviously as this bill hopefully passes the House this week or whatever it does, and then goes through the Senate and the House, this is an issue that is important to him.
He was asked whether the president supports the current language of the bill, which does not make the coverage of pre-existing conditions mandatory, or does he support trying to push that language into the bill? Which is it? Sean Spicer says, I think both. It can't be both. That's what makes governing so hard. To govern is to choose, and the choices are never easy. And if you choose to make coverage of pre-existing conditions optional for the states, then you will pick up some more of those extreme conservative members of the House of Representatives. But you will surely lose other members of the House. And if you push to include in the bill the coverage of pre-existing conditions as a mandatory guarantee, then you will lose those conservative members who want to make it optional. And so, no, it can't be both ways. You can't have both. And so, no, Sean Spicer doesn't have an answer to the question. He doesn't have an answer to the governing choice that the president wants to make on this. And that governing choice is stunningly simple, just tiny, tiny. Compared to the issue that drove us into the Civil War, Donald Trump is the first Republican president who doesn't lavish praise on Abraham Lincoln. It seems that Donald Trump may have only recently discovered that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. Here he is in March, reading a teleprompter about Abraham Lincoln to a room full of professional Republican politicians, all of whom know that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. President Trump seems to be learning that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican from his teleprompter.
As president, Lincoln signed the law that built the first transcontinental railroad, uniting our country from ocean to ocean. Great president. Most people don't even know he was a Republican, right? Does anyone know? A lot of people don't know that. We have to build that up a little bit more. Let's take an ad. Let's use one of those packs.
Pretty insulting to that audience to ask them if they knew that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. That fact appeared earlier in the president's teleprompter, and then he had this kind of delayed, surprised reaction to it. It was a National Republican Congressional Committee event. They know, everyone in that room knows that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. Donald Trump's favorite president wasn't a Republican. But President Trump believes that if his favorite president had been president in 1861 instead of Abraham Lincoln, we wouldn't have had a Civil War.
I mean, had Andrew Jackson been a little bit later, you wouldn't have had the Civil War. He was a very tough person, but he had a big heart, and he was really angry that he saw what was happening with regard to the Civil War. He said, there's no reason for this.
Andrew Jackson didn't see what was happening with regard to the Civil War. He was a Southern slave-owning president from Tennessee 24 years before the Civil War. He died 16 years before the Civil War. White supremacists and many Southern politicians who are not white supremacists but remain bitter about the Civil War don't like Abraham Lincoln, and they do like Andrew Jackson. Steve Bannon is a big Andrew Jackson fan, and no doubt turned President Trump into an Andrew Jackson fan. In order for President Trump to negotiate away the Civil War, he would have to know why the Civil War was fought. John Meacham, who wrote the definitive biography of Andrew Jackson, said to the New York Times today, the expansion of slavery caused the Civil War, and you can't get around that. So what does Trump mean? Would he have let slavery exist but not expand? That's the counterfactual question you have to ask. And so, in the next Trump interview, we can only hope that the interviewer will ask President Trump how he would have avoided the Civil War. How much slavery would President Trump have been willing to allow in the new territories of the United States? That's another version of today's question, easier question, of are you for making coverage of pre-existing conditions mandatory or optional? The governing outcome is always in the details, always. So as John Meacham is insisting, you cannot say that you would have negotiated away the Civil War without telling us exactly how. Exactly how would you do that? Without telling us what your position would have been on allowing slaves in the territories and how that would have convinced the South not to commit treason and not secede from the Union and wage war against the United States of America. The Civil War shamed the South for two reasons. First, because the Confederacy lost the war. And second, decades later, and a century later, when slavery was no longer even remotely morally justifiable, the South was shamed by the reason that it fought the Civil War: slavery. And so Southerners, 100 years later, changed the reason. In the 1950s, segregationists started calling the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression because they could not admit that the South was fighting the war to preserve and protect the institution of slavery. The South could not have been clearer about it at the time. They put it in writing. Mississippi called the, quote, the institution of slavery the greatest material interest of the world. Louisiana said they were fighting the war because of their, quote, determination to preserve African slavery. Texas politicians have always footnoted their policies as coming directly from God, and so Texas justified the Confederacy this way: the servitude of the African race as existing in these states is mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator as recognized by all Christian nations. President Trump thinks a better president than Abraham Lincoln, a president like, say, Andrew Jackson, could have negotiated with Texas over slavery and over the divine word of God as it pertains to slavery. Or maybe he doesn't think that, because perhaps President Trump thinks the Civil War was not about slavery. Perhaps he thinks it was all about Northern aggression, all Abraham Lincoln's fault. We're going to have to wait for the follow-up interview on what the president meant. And that is the question of the day. What did the president mean? North Korea is wondering what the president meant tonight, when the president said, unlike any other president before him, that it would be an honor, his word, an honor to meet with the murderous dictator of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. If you're wondering what Kim Jong-un has to do in order to have a meeting with the president of the United States, the answer is we don't know, because the president won't say. We don't know what he means. That means Kim Jong-un doesn't know what he has to do to get a meeting with the President of the United States. And so we enter the second 100 days of the Trump presidency with a pre-existing condition. No one knows what the president means. Will the president sign a health care bill that allows states to make coverage of pre-existing conditions optional? No one knows. How does the dictator of North Korea have to change his behavior to get a meeting with the President of the United States? No one knows, least of all Kim Jong-un. And how would President Trump, who has been unable to negotiate the passage of a health care bill with his own party in Congress, how would that president have been able to negotiate away the Civil War?
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.